She dragged a guitar case into Biker's garage. What Hell's Angels found inside left them frozen. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the garage's open door, mixing with the thick smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Rico Big Bear Delgado stood in the center of the garage, his massive frame commanding attention as he discussed their next supply run with his fellow Hells Angels. The rumble of idling motorcycles provided a steady backdrop to their conversation. "We'll need to hit the south route this time," Rico said, his deep voice carrying over the mechanical symphony. "Word is the north's getting too hot." He ran a calloused hand through his graying beard, the silver rings on his fingers catching the light. The other bikers nodded in agreement, their leather vests creaking as they shifted their weight. Empty whiskey bottles littered the workbench beside them, evidence of the previous night's revelry. Tools hung on the wall in neat rows, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of the garage floor. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." "Now back to the story, Jimmy." One of the younger members was about to speak when movement at the garage entrance caught everyone's attention. The conversation died instantly as a small figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, struggled to drag a battered guitar case across the oil-stained concrete. Her wild, unkempt hair fell across her face in tangles, and her clothes looked like they'd seen better days. Despite her size, there was a fierce determination in the way she moved, each step deliberate and purposeful. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Children never came to their garage. It was an unspoken rule. The space fell eerily quiet, save for the scraping sound of the guitar case against the floor. Rico's eyes narrowed as he watched the girl approach. Her small arms trembled with effort as she pulled the case, which seemed unusually heavy for what should have been just an instrument. There was something off about the way it moved across the floor, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The girl's worn sneakers came to a stop directly in front of Rico. She looked up at him, and he found himself staring into eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. Her bottom lip quivered slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The words hit Rico like a physical blow. He heard sharp intakes of breath from the men around him, felt their stares boring into him. The girl didn't break eye contact, standing there with a strength that seemed beyond her years. With hands that suddenly felt clumsy, Rico knelt down beside the guitar case. The leather was cracked and worn, the latches barely holding together. Something about its weight, the way it had dragged across the floor, made his stomach twist. He reached for the latches, and they gave way with a soft click. As he lifted the lid, time seemed to slow down. The garage fell completely silent. Even the motorcycles seemed to hold their breath. Inside, curled up in a space never meant to hold anything but music, lay a small boy. His face was marred with cuts and bruises, dried blood caking his temple. He couldn't have been more than 4 years old, and he wasn't moving. Rico's hands froze on the case lid as he stared at the unconscious child. Around him, he could hear his fellow bikers cursing under their breath, shuffling uncomfortably. The little girl stood perfectly still, watching Rico's reaction with those 2 old eyes. Rico's hands trembled as he assessed the boy's injuries, his weathered fingers hovering over the bruised skin. Years of street fights and violent encounters hadn't prepared him for the sight of an injured child. The boy's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one seeming more fragile than the last. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his voice rough with emotion. The garage remained eerily silent, except for the distant rumble of traffic outside. The little girl tugged desperately at his leather sleeve, her small fingers wrapping around the worn material. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You have to help Jimmy. He's hurt real bad." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back, showing a strength that struck Rico deep in his chest. Rico felt the weight of everyone's stares as he gently touched the boy's forehead, checking for fever. The skin was warm, too warm, Blood had dried in the child's dark hair, forming cruel patterns against his pale skin. "Danny!" Rico called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Get the first aid kit from the office." The younger biker snapped into action, boots thundering across the concrete floor. The girl's grip on Rico's sleeve tightened. "The bad men," she said, her voice barely audible. "They found us at the motel. Jimmy wouldn't wake up after—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rico's jaw clenched, anger building in his chest. He'd seen his share of violence, had dealt plenty of it himself. But this was different. This was a line even the Hells Angels didn't cross. "Snake, clear out the back room," Rico ordered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Make space on the couch. Marcus, get some water and any food we got stored away." The bikers moved quickly, their boots echoing through the garage. Danny returned with the first aid kit, setting it down beside the guitar case. Rico began cleaning the boy's wounds with careful movements, his large hands surprisingly gentle. The girl watched every motion, her body trembling, but her eyes never leaving her brother. "What's your name, kid?" Rico asked softly, trying to keep her focused as he worked. "Sarah," she replied, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "That's Jimmy. Mommy said, she said if anything happened, we should find you. She said you'd protect us." The words hit Rico like a punch to the gut. "Mommy says you're my daddy," echoed in his mind, mixing with 1,000 questions he didn't have time to ask. His thoughts raced through faces from his past, trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until today. "All right, listen up." Rico's voice boomed through the garage. "We need to move these kids somewhere safe, now." He turned to his second-in-command. "Mike, get the van ready. We can't risk taking them on bikes." The bikers burst into action, grabbing supplies and securing the garage. But Sarah's grip on Rico's arm didn't loosen. She pressed against his side, her small frame seeking protection from a world that had already shown her too much cruelty. Rico looked down at her, then back at the unconscious boy in the guitar case. Confusion and concern warred in his mind as he tried to process the possibility that these children, these vulnerable, wounded children, might be his own flesh and blood. Sarah sat on an old wooden chair, her feet dangling above the concrete floor. Rico knelt before her, his massive frame somehow less intimidating as he tried to make himself smaller for the child. Behind him, the other bikers worked quietly, preparing the van and gathering supplies. "Start from the beginning," Rico said gently, his voice gravelly but kind. "Tell me about your mama." Sarah's fingers twisted in the hem of her worn t-shirt. "Mommy's name is Claire," she whispered. "Claire Mitchell. She used to show me pictures of you sometimes, late at night when she thought Jimmy was sleeping." Her eyes grew distant, remembering. "She said you were different back then, that you had kind eyes." Rico's breath caught in his throat. Claire Mitchell. The name hit him like a thunderbolt, transporting him back 15 years to a small diner where a waitress with copper hair had stolen his heart. They'd been together for 6 passionate months before she disappeared without a trace. "She never told me about you kids," Rico said, his voice rough with emotion. "Why didn't she come to me?" Sarah's lower lip trembled. "She was scared, said bad people were looking for her, and she had to keep us safe." She glanced at Jimmy, who lay on the couch where Snake had carefully placed him. "But they found us anyway." Danny approached with a bottle of water and some crackers. Sarah accepted them with trembling hands, taking small sips between words. "These men," Rico pressed gently, "the ones who hurt Jimmy, do you know who they are?" Sarah nodded, crumbs falling from her fingers. "They worked for Mr. Sullivan. Mommy was trying to get away from him. She said—" The girl's voice cracked. "She said if anything happened to her, we should find you. That you were strong enough to protect us." Mike, who had been listening nearby, cursed under his breath. "Sullivan's crew," he muttered. "This is bigger than we thought, Rico." Rico's jaw clenched. Thomas Sullivan was a name that carried weight in the criminal underworld, the kind of weight that crushed people. His gang controlled several neighborhoods with brutal efficiency. "Where's your mama now, Sarah?" Rico asked, though dread settled in his stomach as she began to cry. "They took her," Sarah sobbed. "3 days ago. Jimmy and me, we were hiding in the closet like she told us to. We heard—" She covered her face with her hands, her small shoulders shaking. Rico stood up, his fists clenching at his sides. "We need to get these kids to a hospital," he announced. "Jimmy needs proper medical attention." The bikers nodded in agreement, moving with renewed purpose. Snake grabbed his keys while Marcus gathered blankets to wrap around Jimmy for the journey. "The van's ready," Mike called from the garage door. "We can—" The screech of tires outside cut him off. Through the open garage door, they watched a black SUV pull up, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. The engine cut off, and the driver's door opened slowly. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, his silver hair catching the light. Thomas Sullivan himself stood before them, his presence filling the doorway like a shadow. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop 10 degrees as every biker froze in place. Sarah's terrified whimper broke the silence as she pressed herself against Rico's leg, trying to make herself invisible. Rico's hand instinctively moved to shield her, his body tensing for what was to come. Rico moved with practiced calm, keeping his body between Sarah and Sullivan's line of sight. He bent down and whispered to her, "Stay behind me, sweetheart. Don't make a sound." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Jimmy remained unconscious on the couch, wrapped in blankets, while Snake and Marcus stood nearby, ready to move at a moment's notice. Mike approached Rico, speaking in low tones. "Back exit through the workshop. We can use the service alley." He gestured subtly toward the rear of the garage. "The van's already facing that direction." Rico nodded, his mind racing through their options. The workshop area was cluttered with tools and parts, providing enough cover for a discreet exit. They needed to move fast, but without drawing attention. "Snake," Rico murmured, "you know that cabin up near Pine Ridge?" Snake's eyes lit up with understanding. "Yeah, the old Henderson place. Nobody's been there in years. It's about 3 hours up the mountain road." "Perfect." Rico turned to Marcus. "Get the medical supplies in the van. Mike, you're driving. Snake, you're riding point on your bike." He glanced at Sarah, who was still clutching his leg. "Danny, you're our rear guard. Watch for tails." The bikers moved with quiet efficiency, years of working together making words unnecessary. Marcus gathered their emergency medical kit, while Mike slipped out to warm up the van. Danny positioned himself near the garage's main entrance, casually cleaning tools while keeping an eye on Sullivan. Rico knelt beside Sarah. "We're going somewhere safe, okay? But you need to be very brave and very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Sarah's chin trembled, but she squared her small shoulders. "Yes, Daddy," she whispered, and the word sent a jolt through Rico's heart. Snake helped Rico lift Jimmy's limp form, carefully transferring him to the van through the workshop. Sarah followed close behind, her small feet silent on the concrete floor. The van's interior had been hastily arranged with blankets and pillows to make the children comfortable. "Take the mountain route," Rico instructed Mike through the driver's window. "Stay off the main roads. We'll meet at the cabin." Outside, Sullivan remained by his car, speaking into a phone. His presence was like a dark cloud hanging over the garage, but he seemed distracted by his conversation. Danny approached Rico, keeping his voice low. "He's got men watching the street corners. I counted at least 3. Rico nodded, his jaw tight. "We split up. Different routes, same destination. Make it look routine." The bikers began moving their motorcycles, the engines starting one by one, in what appeared to be normal end-of-day activity. Snake led the way, rolling his bike toward the workshop exit. Danny followed, then 2 more bikes. Mike waited until the bikes had cleared the alley before easing the van out. Rico watched from the shadows as the vehicle disappeared around the corner, carrying his newly discovered children to safety. Sullivan's voice carried across the garage. "Leaving early today, Rico?" "Just some routine deliveries," Rico called back, forcing casualness into his tone. He climbed onto his own bike, the familiar rumble of the engine steadying his nerves. As Rico pulled out of the garage, he caught Sullivan's reflection in his mirror. The gang leader's eyes were narrow, suspicious. He was speaking rapidly into his phone again, his free hand gesturing sharply. The night air was cool as Rico guided his bike through the back streets, keeping the van in sight while maintaining enough distance to avoid attention. Above them, clouds covered the moon, providing extra cover for their escape into the mountains. The headlights of Mike's van cut through the darkness as they pulled up to the old Henderson cabin. Rico dismounted his bike, scanning the perimeter with practiced eyes. The wooden structure stood dark against the starlit sky, its windows covered in years of dust and neglect. "Snake, Danny, check the surroundings," Rico ordered quietly. The two men nodded, disappearing into the shadows with flashlights. Marcus began unloading supplies from the van, while Mike helped carry Jimmy inside. The cabin's interior smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. Rico found the generator around back and got it running, bringing dim light to the musty rooms. Sarah hadn't left her brother's side since they arrived, her small hand clutching his as they settled him onto a worn couch. "How's he doing?" Rico asked, kneeling beside them. Jimmy's face was pale, his breathing shallow. The bruises stood out stark against his skin, telling a story Rico wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "He keeps moving," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Like he's having bad dreams." Rico checked Jimmy's temperature with the back of his hand. The boy was warm. Too warm. Marcus appeared with the medical supplies, and together they cleaned and rebandaged his wounds. Jimmy whimpered in his sleep, his small face contorting in pain. "We need to get his fever down," Marcus muttered, preparing a cold compress. "These cuts are infected." Rico paced the cabin's main room, his heavy boots creaking against the wooden floors. The situation felt surreal. Hours ago, he'd been just another biker in the garage. Now, he was responsible for two children. His children. The thought made his chest tight. Sarah sat cross-legged beside the couch, her eyes never leaving her brother. She looked exhausted, but refused to sleep. Instead, she kept vigil, occasionally wiping Jimmy's forehead with the compress or adjusting his blanket. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees. Snake and Danny returned from their patrol, reporting no signs of pursuit. The cabin gradually settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace Mike had started. Jimmy stirred again, making small sounds of distress. Sarah leaned closer to him, and then, in the flickering firelight, she began to sing. Her voice was soft and sweet, carrying a melody that seemed to float in the air. "Hush now, don't you cry. The moon is watching from up high. Close your eyes and go to sleep. In your dreams, you're safe with me." Rico stopped pacing, frozen by the simple lullaby. The words were gentle, but there was something heartbreaking in the way Sarah sang them, like she'd done this many times before, comforting her brother when no one else would. As he watched, Jimmy's restless movements began to calm. Sarah continued singing, her small hand stroking her brother's hair. The gesture was so maternal, so protective, that it made Rico's throat tighten. These children had been forced to grow up too fast, to be strong when they should have been carefree. Settling into a chair by the fire, Rico felt the weight of everything they'd lost. Their mother's absence hung in the air like a shadow, present in Sarah's careful nurturing of her brother, and the way both children carried themselves, as if they were used to facing the world alone. The lullaby drifted to its end, leaving only the crackle of the fire. In that moment, looking at his children in the warm glow, Rico understood the depth of their pain and resilience. They had survived by holding on to each other, creating their own small family in a world that had shown them little kindness. The mountain air bit through Rico's leather jacket as he sat on the cabin's front steps. Inside, the kids were finally sleeping. Sarah curled up in an old armchair next to Jimmy, who'd settled into a more peaceful rest after Marcus gave him some medicine. Stars dotted the black sky above, reminding him of another night, 15 years ago. Maria had loved looking at the stars. She would point out constellations, her dark eyes sparkling as she traced patterns in the sky. Rico closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. He remembered the way Maria's hair smelled like jasmine, how her laugh could light up a room. She'd been a singer at a local bar. That's where they'd met. Her voice had stopped him in his tracks that night, sweet and strong, filling the smoky room with a Spanish love song. Their romance had burned bright and fast. Maria was fire and passion, everything Rico hadn't known he needed. She'd see past his rough exterior, past the patches on his jacket, and the reputation that came with them. "You have a good heart," she'd tell him, placing her hand on his chest, "even if you try to hide it." But their worlds had been too different. The life of a Hell's Angel wasn't one for settling down, and Maria deserved better. At least that's what Rico had told himself when he'd left. The memory of their last fight still haunted him. Her tears, his stubborn pride, the sound of her door slamming behind him. He'd never known she was pregnant. Rico pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. It was creased and worn, but Maria's smile still shone through. She was standing on stage, microphone in hand, frozen in a moment of pure joy. The same joy he'd seen in Sarah's eyes when she sang to her brother. The creak of the cabin door pulled Rico from his thoughts. Sarah stood there in her tattered dress, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Can't sleep?" Rico asked softly. She shook her head, then carefully sat down beside him. For a while, they just listened to the night sounds. Crickets chirping, wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. "Are you really my daddy?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Rico's heart clenched. He looked at the little girl beside him, Maria's dark eyes, his own stubborn chin. The truth was complicated, messy. He wasn't sure about anything anymore, except that these kids needed someone to protect them. "I'm here now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I promise I'll take care of you and Jimmy for as long as you need me." Sarah nodded, seeming to accept this answer. She leaned against his arm, her small body warm against his side. "Jimmy needs medicine," she said. "He gets sick a lot." "We'll get him medicine," Rico assured her. "Marcus is good at fixing people up." "Mommy used to sing to him when he was sick," Sarah continued. "She taught me all her songs." Rico felt tears prick at his eyes. "Your mama. She had the most beautiful voice I ever heard." Sarah looked up at him then, hope shining in her eyes. "Really?" "Really," Rico said. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead, just like he used to do with Maria all those years ago. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Rico stood at the sink, running his hands through his graying beard as he watched Sarah help Jimmy with his breakfast. The boy looked better after a night's rest, though bruises still marked his small face like dark clouds. Marcus, their resident medic, checked Jimmy's injuries one last time. "The cuts are clean now, but we need to get proper medical supplies soon." He spoke quietly to Rico, keeping his voice steady so as not to worry the children. "We'll stop at the pharmacy in Miller's Creek," Rico replied, his eyes never leaving the kids. "It's small enough that we won't draw attention." Bear, one of the older bikers, packed their few supplies into saddlebags. "Sooner we move, better our chances," he muttered, stuffing a worn blanket into one of the bags. Sarah looked up from where she sat with Jimmy, her dark eyes full of questions she was too afraid to ask. Rico walked over and knelt beside them, his massive frame somehow gentler in their presence. "Time to go, kids," he said softly. We can't stay here much longer. Jimmy's lower lip trembled. I don't want to leave. Hey now, Rico said, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. Remember what I promised last night? I'm going to take care of you both. But to do that, we need to keep moving. Sarah squeezed her brother's hand. It's okay, Jimmy. Rico will protect us. The trust in her voice made Rico's chest tighten. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, so different from the city's grime they'd left behind. Rico helped Jimmy into his jacket, an old one of Bear's that hung like a tent on the small boy. Sarah wore one of Rico's t-shirts as a dress, belted with a piece of rope. They'd need to get proper clothes soon. The bikers worked efficiently, loading their motorcycles with practiced ease. Rico had modified his bike's sidecar, making it comfortable enough for the children. He lined it with blankets and cushions, creating a nest of sorts. Look here, Rico said, showing the kids the sidecar. This is your special spot. Sarah, you hold on to Jimmy tight, okay? Just like you've been doing. Sarah nodded solemnly, helping her brother climb in before settling beside him. Rico tucked the blanket around them, checking twice to make sure they were secure. The morning seemed peaceful enough, birds singing in the trees, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Rico allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe they'd make it to Miller's Creek without trouble. Maybe they'd find a way to keep these kids safe. Ready to roll? Bear called out, already straddling his bike. Rico nodded, swinging his leg over his motorcycle. The familiar rumble of the engine was comforting, a reminder of simpler days when his biggest worry was which road to take. Just as the crew prepared to pull away from the cabin, a sound cut through the morning calm. The distinctive rev of a motorcycle engine echoed through the trees, coming from somewhere down the mountain road. That ain't one of ours, Marcus hissed, his hand already reaching for his weapon. The peaceful morning shattered like glass. Rico's heart hammered in his chest as he recognized the engine's pitch. It was the same type of bike the gang leader rode. Scatter! Rico barked, his voice carrying across the clearing. The bikers sprang into action, knowing they had precious little time. Sarah clutched Jimmy tighter in the sidecar, her eyes wide with fear as the sound of approaching danger grew louder. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls like rolling thunder. Rico positioned his bike between the approaching threat and the children, his massive frame a shield against whatever was coming. The rest of his crew formed a protective circle, their engines idling with a low rumble. Through the morning mist, 5 motorcycles emerged. At their head rode a man Rico hadn't seen in years, Danny the Snake Martinez. His leather jacket was adorned with patches that told stories of violence, and his face bore a scar that Rico himself had given him 15 years ago. Well, well, Danny called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. If it isn't Big Bear Rico. He killed his engine, but stayed mounted, his dark eyes scanning the scene before settling on the sidecar. Babysitting now, are we? Rico's jaw tightened. He could feel Sarah trembling behind him, her small hands clutching Jimmy closer. What do you want, Danny? Those kids don't belong to you, Danny said, his smile never reaching his eyes. They belong to someone who owes me a lot of money. Dead or alive. Either way works for me. The other bikers tensed, hands hovering near concealed weapons. Bear shifted his weight, positioning himself for a better angle if things went south. Their mother's dead, Rico growled. Whatever debt she owed died with her. Danny laughed, the sound like gravel in a blender. That's not how it works, old friend. You know that better than anyone. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. Remember, Phoenix? When you left me bleeding in that warehouse? Debts don't just disappear. Rico's mind raced. He could take Danny in a fight. He'd done it before. But not with the kids so close. Not with Danny's crew ready to open fire. One wrong move, and the children would be caught in the crossfire. Those days are behind us, Rico said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. Walk away, Danny. This isn't your fight. Everything's my fight when someone crosses me. Danny took another step forward. Hand over the kids, and maybe I'll forget about our old score. Sarah whimpered behind Rico, and something in him snapped. The protective instinct that had been growing since yesterday surged through his veins like liquid fire. Last warning, Rico rumbled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Back off. Danny's hand moved toward his jacket, and the clearing erupted into motion. Bear and Marcus revved their engines, the sudden roar startling Danny's crew. Rico seized the moment of confusion, gunning his engine and spinning his bike around in a shower of gravel. Hold on tight, he shouted to the kids as he shot forward, weaving between two of Danny's men. Behind him, his crew scattered in different directions, drawing Danny's followers away from Rico and the children. Sarah's arms squeezed tight around Jimmy as they thundered down the mountain road. Rico could hear Danny shouting orders, but the sound grew fainter as they picked up speed. The wind whipped past them, carrying away the echo of pursuing engines. Rico knew Danny wouldn't follow immediately. He'd need time to regroup, to figure out which trail to follow. But the danger wasn't over. It was never that simple with Danny the Snake Martinez. Through his mirror, Rico caught a glimpse of Sarah's face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, but her grip was sure and steady around her brother. They were counting on him now, trusting him with their lives. He wouldn't let them down. The safe house was a cramped two-bedroom apartment above a Chinese restaurant, owned by Mickey Chen, an old friend who owed Rico more favors than either of them could count. The smell of fried rice and garlic wafted up through the floorboards as Rico paced the worn carpet, his phone pressed to his ear. Look, I need protection now, not tomorrow, Rico growled into the phone. His contact at the police department, Detective Martinez, was sympathetic, but couldn't move any faster. These kids are in danger. Sarah sat cross-legged on a faded couch, carefully dabbing her brother's forehead with a damp cloth. Jimmy's fever had broken, but the bruises on his small body told a story that made Rico's blood boil. The boy stirred, whimpering in his sleep. Shh, it's okay, Sarah whispered, her voice soft and maternal despite her young age. Big Bear's watching over us now. Rico's heart clenched at the nickname. He'd earned it years ago for his size and ferocity, but hearing it from her innocent lips gave it a different meaning entirely. Through the window, the city lights flickered like distant stars. Rico's crew had split up to throw off Danny's gang, but word on the street was they were closing in. Mickey had spotted two of Danny's men asking questions at the corner store just hours ago. They're getting closer. Marcus, one of Rico's most trusted men, muttered from his position by the window. We should move again. Rico shook his head, ending his call with the detective. No. Jimmy's too weak, and they'll be watching the roads. He ran a hand through his graying beard. We make our stand here. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant clatter of pots and pans from the restaurant below. Rico checked his phone again. No messages from his other riders. The silence was eating at him, but he couldn't show his worry, not with Sarah watching his every move. As night settled over the city, Rico sent Marcus to get some rest while he took first watch. Sarah had finally dozed off next to her brother, her small hand clutching his protectively. Rico draped his leather jacket over them both. Sitting in a worn armchair by the window, Rico kept his eyes on the street below, while his mind wandered to places he'd avoided for years. He thought about the life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, the violence, the brotherhood, the code he'd lived by. It had all seemed so important once. But now, watching these two children sleep, he saw his world through different eyes. The very life he'd built might be the thing that gets them killed. These kids needed more than just protection from Danny. They needed protection from the entire world Rico had embraced for so long. I won't let anyone hurt you, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming of the old radiator. "Either of you." Sarah shifted in her sleep, snuggling closer to Jimmy. In the dim light, they looked so peaceful, so innocent. Rico felt something shift inside him, a tenderness he thought he'd buried long ago. He made a silent vow then, not just to keep them safe from Danny, but to give them the life they deserved. A life away from the violence and darkness that had consumed their mother's world. His world. Whatever it took, he would make sure these children had a chance at something better. The night stretched on, and Rico kept his vigil, his hand resting on the gun at his side, his heart growing softer with each passing hour. The evening air was thick with humidity as Rico and Sarah sat on the rickety fire escape outside Mickey's apartment. The metal creaked beneath them, but Rico had checked. It would hold. Below, the busy street buzzed with life, the neon signs from the restaurant casting a soft glow on their faces. Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, her small frame dwarfed by Rico's massive presence. "What was your house like when you were little?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. Rico shifted, unused to such personal questions. He looked down at his weathered hands, covered in faded tattoos and old scars. "It wasn't much," he said finally. "Just a small place on the east side of town. My mama worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table." "Like my mommy did," Sarah nodded, understanding in her young eyes. Rico's throat tightened. "Yeah, like your mommy." He paused, remembering Marie's determined spirit, her fierce independence. "I had a treehouse," he continued, forcing the memories of Marie away. "Built it myself when I was 12. Wasn't much to look at, but it was mine." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Did you have any brothers or sisters?" "One sister," Rico replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "Angela. She was 4 years younger than me. I used to carry her on my shoulders everywhere we went." "Like you carried Jimmy today?" Sarah smiled, referencing how Rico had carefully transported her brother from the car to the apartment. "Yeah, just like that." Rico's voice softened. He hadn't thought about Angela in years. She loved butterflies, used to chase them all over the neighborhood. Sarah leaned against his arm, and Rico found himself not minding the contact. "What happened to her?" Rico stared out at the city lights. "She moved away, got married, had kids of her own. We don't talk much anymore. Not since I joined the club." "The motorcycle club?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Rico nodded. "Made some choices back then. Thought I knew what was important." He looked down at Sarah. "Wasn't always right about that." From inside the apartment, a sound caught their attention. Jimmy's weak cough followed by a whimper. They both turned toward the window. "Jimmy!" Sarah called out, scrambling back through the window. Rico followed close behind. Jimmy lay on the couch, his face flushed and sweating. His breathing was labored, and when Rico pressed a hand to his forehead, the skin burned hot against his palm. "He's burning up," Rico muttered, panic rising in his chest. The boy's injuries needed proper medical attention, something they couldn't provide here. Sarah grabbed her brother's hand. "He's scared," she whispered. "When he gets sick, I usually sing to him. Mommy taught me songs that help him sleep." Rico nodded, his mind racing with possible solutions while trying to keep his voice steady. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Sing for him." As Sarah began to softly hum a familiar lullaby, Rico watched the siblings, his heart heavy with worry. Jimmy needed a doctor, and soon. But with Danny's men watching the streets and hospitals, getting medical help would mean risking everything. Rico's motorcycle roared through the empty streets, the cool night air whipping past them. Sarah sat in front of him, wrapped tightly in his leather jacket, while Jimmy lay unconscious in the makeshift sling across his chest. The boy's fever had spiked dangerously high, and Rico knew they were running out of time. He pulled up to a small medical clinic on the outskirts of town. The neon, open 24 hours sign flickered weakly in the darkness. Dr. Martinez had helped the club before. No questions asked. Rico hoped tonight would be no different. "Stay close to me," Rico whispered to Sarah as they approached the clinic's side entrance. He shifted Jimmy's weight in his arms, the boy's skin burning through the thin fabric of his shirt. The door buzzed open, and Dr. Martinez, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, ushered them inside quickly. "Back room," he directed, his expression growing serious as he saw Jimmy's condition. Under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the examination room, Jimmy's injuries looked even worse. The bruises had darkened, spreading across his small chest like angry shadows. Dr. Martinez worked silently, checking vital signs and cleaning wounds while Sarah held her brother's hand. "These injuries," Dr. Martinez said finally, looking up at Rico with concern etched deep in his face. "They're not from an accident. This is abuse." He reached for the phone on the wall. "I need to call social services." "No." Rico's voice was firm but quiet. "No calls." Dr. Martinez's hand stayed on the receiver. "Rico, I've helped you and your club many times, but this is different. These are children. There are protocols." "They're my children," Rico interrupted, the words surprising even himself with their intensity. "Their mother. She's gone. They have no one else." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "Your children." "Rico, if you're harboring—" "Please," Sarah's small voice cut through the tension. "Please help Jimmy. We can't go back there. They'll hurt us again." Dr. Martinez looked between Rico and the children, his professional judgment warring with his conscience. "The boy needs antibiotics and proper care. These injuries could become serious if not treated correctly." "Then treat them," Rico said, stepping closer to the examination table. "You know me, Doc. You know I'm good for it. It's not about the money, Rico." Dr. Martinez ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "There are people looking for these kids, aren't there? Dangerous people." Rico didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The doctor sighed heavily. "This isn't like patching up a knife wound or setting a broken bone. These are children who need protection, stability." "I'll protect them," Rico said, his voice thick with determination. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Martinez studied Rico's face for a long moment. "The gang that's after them, they won't stop looking. You know that, right? They'll check every hospital, every clinic in the area." "Then help us now," Rico pleaded, his usual tough exterior cracking slightly. "Give us a chance to get somewhere safe." The doctor glanced at Sarah, who was still holding her brother's hand, singing softly to him. His shoulders slumped in resignation. "I'll treat him," he said finally. "But Rico, you need to understand, you're putting yourself in serious danger. These people, they won't care who you are or what club you belong to." Rico looked at the children, at his children, and nodded. "I understand, and I don't care. They're my responsibility now." Dr. Martinez finished bandaging Jimmy's wounds and administered the antibiotics. The boy's fever had started to break, bringing relief to everyone in the small examination room. Rico gathered the children close, knowing they couldn't stay much longer. Outside the clinic, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft, purple hues. Rico's fellow bikers waited in the parking lot, their motorcycles lined up like silent guardians. The rumble of distant traffic reminded them that the city was waking up, and with it, the dangers they faced. "We need to move," Rico said, adjusting Jimmy in his arms. The boy was still weak, but conscious now, his small fingers clutching Rico's leather jacket. "The gang will be checking every medical facility in the city." Jax, a towering figure with graying temples and hard eyes, stepped forward. His weathered face showed the kind of determination Rico hadn't seen in years. "I know a place," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. My sister's got a cabin up in the mountains, about 4 hours north. Remote, defensible. The other bikers turned to look at him in surprise. Jax never talked about his family. Most hadn't even known he had a sister. "You sure about this?" Rico asked, studying his old friend's face. "Bringing your family into this?" Sarah moved closer to Rico, her small hand finding his. The gesture wasn't lost on Jax, whose expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Look," Jax said, running a hand through his hair. "I've been watching these kids, seeing how they trust us, how they look at us like we're their heroes or something." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've got a daughter of my own. Haven't seen her in years. My choices, my mistakes. I walked away thinking I was protecting her from this life." The parking lot fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, unused to such emotional honesty from one of their own. "These kids," Jax continued, gesturing to Sarah and Jimmy, "they need us. All of us. And maybe this is a chance to make things right." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Rico nodded, understanding the weight of Jax's confession. The man who had always been the most distant, the most closed-off member of their group, was now offering not just help, but a piece of his own carefully guarded past. "Your sister," Rico said carefully. "She won't mind harboring fugitives?" A ghost of a smile crossed Jax's face. "She's family, and she knows what it's like to need protection." He looked at Sarah and Jimmy. "Besides, these kids, they're family now too, aren't they?" The other bikers murmured in agreement. What had started as an unexpected intrusion into their world had become something more. A chance at redemption, at being the protectors they never thought they could be. "We'll need supplies," one of the bikers said, already making mental lists. "Food, medicine, whatever the doc gave us for the kid. And we'll need to split up," another added. "Take different routes. Throw them off our trail." Rico looked down at Sarah, who was fighting to keep her eyes open after the long night. Jimmy had fallen asleep again in his arms, his breathing finally steady and peaceful. He met Jax's gaze and saw in it the same fierce protectiveness he felt in his own heart. "All right," Rico said, his decision made. "We move in 30 minutes. Everyone knows what to do." The convoy of motorcycles thundered down the empty highway, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Rico led the group, with Sarah holding tight to his waist. Jimmy, still weak from his fever, was secured in a makeshift sling across his chest. The boy's small body radiated warmth against him, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Jax rode close behind, scanning the road for any signs of pursuit. They had split into 3 groups, each taking different routes to the farmhouse. The strategy seemed to be working. So far, they hadn't spotted any of the gang's vehicles. The first roadblock came at sunrise. A police checkpoint sprawled across the highway, lights flashing. Rico's heart hammered in his chest as he signaled the others to slow down. They couldn't risk going through, not with the children. "Hold on tight," Rico murmured to Sarah as he veered onto a narrow dirt road. The rest of their group followed, bikes kicking up clouds of dust. The detour cost them precious time, but it was better than the alternative. They encountered their second obstacle an hour later. A bridge was out, forcing them to backtrack several miles to find another crossing. Rico could feel the tension building in his shoulders. Every delay gave the gang more time to catch up. "You okay back there?" he called to Sarah during a brief stop. The girl nodded bravely, though her face was pale with exhaustion. Jimmy stirred in his sling, but didn't wake. Just as they turned onto the county road leading to the farmhouse, Jax's warning shout cut through the air. In the side mirror, Rico caught sight of 3 black SUVs racing toward them, gaining ground quickly. "Go!" Rico roared, twisting the throttle. Their bikes surged forward, but the SUVs were faster on the straight road. The gang was closing in. The farmhouse appeared in the distance, a weathered 2-story building surrounded by open fields. They were so close, but the gang vehicles were nearly upon them. One SUV pulled alongside Rico's bike, trying to force him off the road. Sarah screamed as the vehicle swerved toward them. Rico dropped back sharply, letting the SUV shoot past. The maneuver bought them a few precious seconds, but more vehicles were closing in. Jax suddenly broke formation, swinging his bike around to face the pursuing vehicles. The other bikers followed his lead, forming a barrier between Rico and the gang. Through the dust and chaos, Rico heard Jax shout, "Get those kids to safety!" Rico didn't hesitate. With Sarah clinging to him and Jimmy secured against his chest, he gunned the engine. The farmhouse grew larger in his vision, as shouts and the screech of tires filled the air behind him. The gang vehicles were forced to slow, as the bikers blocked their path. Rico could hear the sound of metal striking metal, angry voices, and revving engines. But he didn't look back. Couldn't look back. His entire world narrowed to the stretch of road ahead and the precious cargo he carried. They burst through the farmhouse gate with such force that it swung wildly on its hinges. Rico didn't slow until they reached the front porch, where he quickly dismounted and hurried the children inside. Only then did he turn to see the aftermath. The gang vehicles had been stopped about a quarter-mile back, surrounded by Rico's crew. Whatever had happened in those crucial moments had bought them the time they needed. As Rico watched, the gang members retreated to their vehicles and slowly backed away, leaving the bikers to make their way to the farmhouse. They had made it, but just barely, and everyone knew this was far from over. The farmhouse kitchen glowed with warm lamplight as Rico sat at the old wooden table with Sarah and Jimmy. Paper plates held simple sandwiches. It was all they could manage for now. The windows were covered with thick blankets, hiding them from any watching eyes outside. Sarah picked at the crust of her sandwich, her small fingers tearing it into tiny pieces. "What was Mommy like?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you knew her." Rico's hands stilled on the table. He looked at the little girl's face, seeing traces of her mother in the curve of her cheeks, the determined set of her chin. Jimmy looked up too, his fever-bright eyes curious. "Your mama," Rico started, his voice rough with emotion. "She was something special." He cleared his throat, remembering back to easier days. "I met her at a music festival, if you can believe it. She was singing on stage. Not the main act, just a small afternoon show. But her voice." He shook his head, lost in the memory. "It was like nothing I'd ever heard before." Sarah leaned forward, sandwich forgotten. "Did she play guitar? That old blue Gibson?" Rico nodded, a small smile touching his weathered face. "She took it everywhere. Said it was her lucky charm. She named it Charlie." Jimmy giggled at that, and Rico felt something warm spread through his chest at the sound. "She wasn't afraid of anything, your mama," Rico continued. "Not even me, and back then, I scared most people. But she'd just laugh and tell me I was all bark and no bite." His voice grew softer. "We were together for almost 2 years. Best time of my life." "Why did you leave?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide and searching. Rico's heart clenched. "I didn't leave her, sweetheart. She left me. Never told me why. Just disappeared one day." He swallowed hard. "If I'd known about you two." Sarah reached across the table and put her small hand over his large, calloused one. "It's okay," she said. "You're here now." Jimmy, fighting sleep, crawled into Rico's lap. The boy's slight weight settled against his chest, reminding him of their desperate ride earlier. "Tell more about Mommy," he mumbled. Rico wrapped one arm around Jimmy, keeping him secure. "She loved sunflowers," he said quietly. "Used to stop at every flower stand we passed, just to see if they had any. And she always wore this silver charm bracelet that jingled when she played guitar." He paused, remembering. "She had the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known. Looks like she passed that on to both of you." Sarah yawned, struggling to keep her eyes open. Rico helped her to the makeshift bed they'd arranged in the corner of the kitchen, where they could keep watch over both exits. Jimmy was already asleep in his arms. After tucking Sarah in, Rico settled into a chair by the window, cradling Jimmy against his chest. The boy's peaceful breathing filled the quiet room. Rico touched his son's forehead. The fever seemed to be breaking finally. Looking at these two children, Rico felt the tough shell he'd built around his heart begin to crack. For years, he'd convinced himself that love was weakness, that caring only led to pain. But now, watching over these two precious lives, he understood something different. His eyes burned with unshed tears as he gently stroked Jimmy's hair. These kids needed more than just protection. They needed a father. The thought terrified him, but somewhere deep inside, Rico knew he was already changing. The hardened biker was becoming something else, something he never thought possible. A man capable of giving and receiving love. The morning sun streamed through the farmhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Rico stood at the kitchen counter, making pancakes, while Sarah and Jimmy sat at the table, their legs swinging beneath their chairs. The smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the air, creating an almost normal domestic scene. "Make mine look like a bear," Jimmy called out, his earlier fever now completely gone. His bruises had faded to yellowish patches, and his smile had returned full force. Rico carefully shaped the batter, something he'd never imagined himself doing before. "A bear, huh? Well, this might look more like a blob with ears, but we'll call it a bear." Sarah giggled, watching Rico concentrate on his pancake art. "You're getting better," she said encouragingly. "Yesterday's butterfly only looked a little bit like a squashed bug." From the living room, Jax and two other bikers played cards, their leather vests draped over chairs. They looked almost comfortable, though their weapons remained within easy reach. The farmhouse had become their sanctuary over the past few days, a place where they could almost forget the danger that lurked outside. Rico flipped the pancake onto Jimmy's plate, earning a delighted squeal from the boy. "There's your bear, though I think it might be more of a grizzly than a teddy." Sarah helped Jimmy pour syrup over his breakfast, showing the kind of care that made Rico's heart ache. She'd had to grow up too fast, but here, in these quiet moments, she could just be a kid again. Outside, the rumble of vehicles approaching broke the peaceful morning. Rico tensed immediately, moving to the window while motioning for the children to stay quiet. Jax and the others were already on their feet, hands hovering near their weapons. Through the dusty window, Rico spotted 3 police cars coming up the dirt road. His jaw clenched. They'd been careful about staying hidden, but somehow they'd been found. "Kids," he said quietly, "I need you to go to the back room like we practiced. Okay?" Sarah nodded, taking Jimmy's hand. They drilled this scenario, knowing it might come. The children disappeared down the hallway just as a knock came at the door. 2 officers stood on the porch, their faces grim. "Mr. Delgado, we need to talk about the children." Before Rico could respond, the sound of motorcycles cut through the air. Not the familiar rumble of his crew's bikes, but the high-pitched whine of sport bikes. The gang's preferred rides. They appeared from both directions on the road, blocking any escape route. The officers reached for their weapons, but Rico knew they were outmatched. The gang had been waiting for this moment, using the police presence as cover for their attack. "Get inside," Rico ordered the officers, surprising them with his commanding tone. "You want to protect those kids? Then you better help us hold this place." The bikers moved with practiced efficiency, securing windows and doors. Rico's mind raced with plans, strategies, escape routes. But one thing was crystal clear. He wasn't letting anyone near those children. "Those kids in there," Rico said to his crew, his voice hard with determination. "They're family now, and we protect our family." The gang members outside began to position themselves around the farmhouse. Rico could see their leader, a cold smile on his face, as he gestured for his men to surround the building. Rico checked his weapon and nodded to his crew. They would make their stand here, in this farmhouse that had become more than just a hideout. It had become home. The farmhouse transformed into a fortress within minutes. Jax and two other bikers pushed heavy furniture against the windows while the police officers radioed for backup, their voices tight with tension. Rico watched his crew work with practiced efficiency, knowing each moment was precious. "We need more time," Jax muttered, dragging a heavy bookshelf across the living room floor. "Backup's at least 30 minutes out." Rico nodded, his mind racing through their options. The wooden walls of the old farmhouse wouldn't stop bullets, but they could create enough barriers to slow down an attack. He helped position an old metal filing cabinet against one of the windows, its weight reassuring. "Check the back door again," Rico ordered one of his men. "Make sure it's secure." Sarah and Jimmy huddled in the safe room, a small storage space under the stairs that Rico had prepared days ago. He'd stocked it with water, snacks, and even a few of Jimmy's favorite comic books. Now he needed to see them one more time before everything went down. Rico knocked gently on the door. "It's me, kids." The door creaked open, and Sarah's face appeared, her eyes wide but steady. Jimmy sat on a blanket behind her, clutching his worn teddy bear. Rico's heart clenched at the sight of them, so vulnerable yet so brave. He knelt down to their level, his large frame barely fitting in the small space. "Listen," he said softly. "I need you both to be extra quiet and stay right here, no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" Jimmy nodded solemnly. "Like hide and seek." "Yeah, buddy, just like hide and seek." Rico ruffled the boy's hair, marveling at how such a simple gesture had become so natural. "Sarah, you're in charge down here. Keep your brother safe." Sarah's chin lifted, showing that same determination he'd seen when she first walked into his garage with the guitar case. "I will. I promise." Rico pulled them both into a tight hug, something he would have felt awkward about just weeks ago. Now it felt as natural as breathing. "I'm so proud of you both," he whispered. "You're the bravest kids I've ever known." "Are you going to be okay?" Sarah's voice wavered slightly. "Don't you worry about me, sweetheart. Your old man's tougher than he looks." The words "old man" slipped out naturally, and Rico realized he meant them. Somewhere along the way, these children had become his, and he would die before letting anyone hurt them. "I love you, Daddy," Jimmy said quietly, pressing his face into Rico's leather vest. The words hit Rico like a physical blow, filling his chest with warmth and determination. "I love you too, both of you. Now stay quiet and stay hidden." He closed the door gently, listening to make sure the latch caught. When he turned around, Jax was standing there, a knowing look in his eyes. "We're ready," Jax said simply. "Everything's secured as best we can make it." Rico nodded, checking his weapon one last time. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The farmhouse had grown quiet, everyone in position, waiting. Then they heard it, the distinctive sound of multiple motorcycles approaching from the distance. The noise grew louder, echoing across the open fields. Rico moved to his position by the front window, his face set in grim determination. The gang was coming, and this time, there would be no running away. The last rays of sunlight painted long shadows across the farmhouse yard as motorcycles roared up the gravel driveway. Rico watched from behind a partially covered window as 15 bikes pulled up in a V formation. His grip tightened on his weapon as the gang members dismounted, their leather jackets gleaming in the dying light. "Everyone stay sharp," Rico whispered into his radio. His crew was positioned strategically throughout the house. Jax by the back door, 2 men upstairs, and the others covering the remaining entry points. The gang's leader stepped forward, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. He was tall and lean, with a snake tattoo curling up his neck. "Come on out, Rico," he shouted. "We know you've got those kids in there." Rico's jaw clenched. He could hear the faint sound of Sarah humming to Jimmy in their hiding place, trying to keep him calm, The sound steeled his resolve. "Last chance to walk away," Rico called back through the window. "These kids are under our protection now." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the yard. "You've gone soft, Rico. The mighty Big Bear playing daddy? It's pathetic." He signaled to his men, who began spreading out around the house. "We'll tear this place apart if we have to." Inside, Rico moved silently between positions, checking on his crew. Each man nodded grimly, weapons ready. They weren't just protecting kids anymore. They were protecting family. The first shot shattered a window upstairs. Glass rained down as the gang opened fire, bullets splintering wood and punching through walls. Rico's men returned fire, carefully picking their shots. 2 gang members went down immediately, clutching their legs and arms. The bikers weren't aiming to kill, just disable. "Keep them away from the house," Rico ordered through his radio. He could hear Jimmy crying now, Sarah's voice trying to comfort him. The sound filled him with rage. The gang charged forward, using vehicles and trees as cover. Rico spotted one trying to break through a side window and dropped him with a clean shot to the shoulder. But there were too many of them, and they were getting closer. Suddenly, the back door crashed open. Jax's voice crackled over the radio. "They're breaking through!" Rico sprinted toward the sound, his heart pounding. He rounded the corner just as 3 gang members burst in. Jax was grappling with one, while Rico tackled another. The third raised his weapon, but one of Rico's men shot him from the stairs. The fighting became chaotic, hand-to-hand in the confined space. Rico's fist connected with a jaw, sending one attacker sprawling. He heard more glass breaking, more shouts, more gunfire. Then he saw him. The gang leader had slipped in during the chaos. He was heading straight for the storage room where the kids were hidden. "No!" Rico roared, launching himself forward. He caught the leader just as he reached for the door handle. They crashed into the wall together, trading brutal blows. The leader was younger, faster, but Rico fought with the desperate strength of a father protecting his children. "You're dead, Rico!" the leader snarled, landing a solid punch to Rico's ribs. "And those brats are next!" Something snapped inside Rico. He slammed his head forward, catching the leader in the face. Blood sprayed from his broken nose. They grappled viciously, crashing through furniture, neither man willing to give ground. Around them, the battle raged on. Gunshots and shouts filled the air. Rico could hear his men fighting, holding the line, but they were outnumbered. The gang was pushing deeper into the house, and time was running out. The leader pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the chaos. Rico barely managed to catch his wrist as it descended toward his chest. They struggled for control, muscles straining, both men knowing this was a fight to the finish. The knife trembled between them, its edge inches from Rico's throat. The gang leader's face was a mask of hatred, blood still flowing from his broken nose. Rico's arms burned with exhaustion as he fought to keep the blade at bay. "You're finished, old man," the leader sneered, pressing his weight forward. The knife edge drew closer, and Rico could feel his strength failing. Suddenly a shadow loomed behind them. Jax, his face streaked with blood and grime, lunged forward with desperate speed. "Rico!" he shouted. Time seemed to slow. Rico saw the flash of metal as the gang leader twisted, redirecting the knife toward the new threat. Jax's momentum carried him forward, straight into the blade's path. The knife plunged deep into his chest. "No!" Rico roared, shoving the gang leader away. Jax stumbled backward, his hands clutching the wound. Dark red spread across his shirt like spilled wine. The gang leader laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "One down!" Rico caught Jax as he fell, lowering him gently to the floor. Around them, the sounds of fighting continued. But they seemed distant now, like thunder from a far-off storm. "Hang on, brother," Rico pleaded, pressing his hands over the wound. "Just hang on." Jax's breathing was ragged, his face pale. "The kids!" he gasped, gripping Rico's arm with surprising strength. "You have to. Protect them. Don't let my sacrifice be for nothing." "You're gonna be fine," Rico insisted, but they both knew it was a lie. Blood seeped between his fingers. Too much blood. I had a family once, Jax whispered, his eyes growing distant. Lost them. My fault. But these kids, they're our chance to make things right. The gang leader moved forward, knife still dripping. How touching, he mocked. The tough biker dies protecting children. Pathetic. Something inside Rico snapped. With a roar of pure rage, he launched himself at the leader. They crashed into the wall, Rico's fists finding their mark again and again. All his grief, all his fury, poured into each blow. The leader fought back, but Rico was beyond pain now. He knocked the knife away and wrapped his hands around the leader's throat. "You want to see pathetic?" he growled. "Look in the mirror." Gunshots exploded nearby. Several of the gang members stumbled backward through the doorway, pursued by Rico's crew. They were retreating, breaking under the bikers' determination. The leader saw his men falling back and knew the tide had turned. He kicked free of Rico's grip and scrambled away. "This isn't over," he shouted, but his voice held a note of fear now. Rico let him go, turning back to Jax. He knelt beside his fallen friend, taking his hand. Jax's breathing was shallow now, his skin growing cold. "Tell them," Jax whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tell them I was brave." "You were the bravest of us all," Rico said softly. Jax's grip loosened, and his eyes drifted closed for the last time. The house grew quiet as the gang retreated, engines roaring into the distance. Rico's men gathered around, heads bowed in respect. They had won the battle, but the victory tasted like ashes in their mouths. Rico stood slowly, his heart heavy with grief. He looked at his brothers, saw the same pain reflected in their eyes. They had lost one of their own, someone who had proven that even the hardest heart could change. In the silence that followed, they could hear Sarah singing softly to Jimmy from their hiding place. The sound reminded them all of why they had fought, why Jax had given his life. They were no longer just a gang of bikers. They were protectors, guardians, family. The morning sun crept through the farmhouse windows, casting long shadows across Jax's body. They had cleaned him up as best they could, covering him with his beloved leather jacket. Rico knelt beside his fallen brother, his hand resting on the cold leather. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You deserved better than this." Around him, the other bikers moved quietly, gathering their belongings. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Blood stained the wooden floors, and broken furniture littered the rooms, silent witnesses to the night's violence. Sarah approached cautiously, her small hand finding Rico's. "Is Mr. Jax in heaven now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rico pulled her close, fighting back tears. "Yes, sweetheart. He's watching over us from up there." Jimmy stood in the doorway, his injuries mostly healed, but his eyes full of confusion and fear. One of the bikers, Tank, lifted the boy onto his shoulders, trying to shield him from the sight of death. "We need to move," Tank said softly. "The police will be here soon, and we can't explain this." Rico nodded, standing slowly. His body ached from the fight, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. "Get the bikes ready," he ordered. "We'll bury him proper, then head out." They laid Jax to rest beneath an old oak tree behind the farmhouse. The bikers formed a circle around the grave, their heads bowed in respect. Each one placed something personal on the fresh earth: a ring, a bandana, a favorite lighter. Sarah stepped forward, clutching her tiny silver necklace, the last gift from her mother. "This is for protecting us," she whispered, placing it carefully among the other offerings. Rico watched her, his heart swelling with both pride and sadness. These children had lost so much, yet they still found the strength to give. He thought of Jax's last words about making things right, about second chances. "Time to go," he announced, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines rumbling to life in the crisp morning air. Rico lifted Jimmy onto his bike, securing him carefully before helping Sarah climb on behind them. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his leather jacket. "Are we safe now, Daddy?" she asked, the word Daddy still new and precious between them. Rico glanced at his brothers, these tough men who had become a family to these children. They nodded back, their faces set with determination. They would die before letting harm come to these kids, just as Jax had. "Yeah, baby girl," Rico answered, starting his engine. "You're safe with us. Always will be." The convoy of motorcycles pulled away from the farmhouse, leaving behind the fresh grave and the echoes of battle. Sarah hummed softly, a lullaby that seemed to calm both her and Jimmy. Rico felt their trust in him, their complete faith that he would protect them. As they rode into the brightening day, Rico silently renewed his promise to Jax and to himself. These children would have the life they deserved, not just survival, but love, security, and family. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. The rumble of motorcycles filled the morning air as they disappeared down the dusty road, leaving the farmhouse and its memories behind. The old mountain cabin creaked in the morning breeze as Rico pulled up the gravel driveway, his motorcycle's engine quieting to a low rumble. Behind him, a line of bikes followed, carrying his brothers, who had stuck by him through everything. Sarah's arms were still wrapped tightly around his waist, while Jimmy sat securely in front of him, protected by Rico's broad chest. The cabin sat nestled among towering pine trees, its weathered wooden walls telling stories of years gone by. A small stream trickled nearby, its gentle sound mixing with birdsong. It wasn't much, but it was far from the chaos they'd left behind. "This is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with both uncertainty and hope as she climbed off the bike. Rico helped Jimmy down, ruffling the boy's hair. "Yeah, kiddo. This is our new place. What do you think?" The children stood close together, taking in their surroundings. Jimmy's eyes widened at the sight of a tire swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree, while Sarah noticed the flower boxes beneath the windows, though they were empty now. Tank and the others began unloading their supplies, food, clothes, and the few possessions they'd managed to save. The cabin's interior was basic but clean, with a stone fireplace dominating the main room and 3 small bedrooms branching off a narrow hallway. "Can I have the room with the window seat?" Sarah asked, already dragging her backpack toward it. Rico nodded, watching as she and Jimmy explored their new home. The furniture was sparse, just some basic beds, a worn couch, and a sturdy kitchen table. But it was more than enough. They could build from here. As the day progressed, the cabin slowly came to life. Tank fired up the old wood stove, the smell of coffee soon filling the air. 2 other bikers, Mouse and Diesel, worked on getting the generator running, while Rico and the kids unpacked their belongings. Sarah found an old radio in one of the cupboards, and soon soft music drifted through the rooms. Rico watched as she showed Jimmy how to make his bed, just like their mother had taught her. The sight made his chest tight with emotion. By evening, the cabin felt different. Curtains hung in the windows, dishes filled the cupboards, and the kids' drawings were already taped to the refrigerator. The other bikers had set up a security perimeter, but they kept it subtle, not wanting to frighten the children. Rico stood on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Sarah joined him, her small hand slipping into his calloused one. Jimmy was already half asleep on the couch inside, clutching the stuffed bear Tank had given him. "The flowers need water," Sarah said, pointing to the empty boxes. "Mommy always had flowers." Rico squeezed her hand gently. "We'll plant some tomorrow, whatever kind you want." She looked up at him, her eyes serious. "And we can stay here? We don't have to run anymore?" Rico knelt down to her level, seeing the hope and fear mixed in her expression. He thought of everything they'd been through, the losses, the battles, the sacrifices. But here, in this peaceful place, With the sound of the stream and the whisper of pine needles, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. "Are we finally home?" she whispered. Rico smiled softly, pulling her into a gentle hug. "This is home," he said, his voice firm with conviction. He knew they had built something beautiful, despite everything they'd been through. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees as Rico stood in the cabin's small garden patch, showing Sarah and Jimmy how to prepare the soil for planting. His large hands, once used only for fighting, now gently demonstrated how to dig small holes for flower seeds. "Like this?" Sarah asked, carefully placing a marigold seed in the earth. "Perfect," Rico nodded, his weathered face softening into a smile. "Your mama would be proud of your green thumb." Jimmy, still sporting a few healing bruises, patted the dirt with his small hands. "Will they grow big and tall like you, Bear?" he asked, using the nickname he'd given Rico. "These ones'll stay small and pretty," Rico explained, "just right for the window boxes." Tank emerged from the cabin, carrying cups of hot chocolate, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the delicate mugs he held. "Thought you gardeners might need a break," he said, carefully handing the steaming drinks to the children. Inside the cabin, Mouse was teaching Sarah how to play chess on an old set they'd found in a closet. His patience seemed endless as he explained each piece's movement, his face lighting up when she captured her first pawn. Diesel worked with Jimmy on a puzzle, their laughter filling the room as they searched for matching pieces. Rico watched from the kitchen as he prepared lunch, amazed at how these hardened men had transformed. The same guys who'd once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies now spent their afternoons reading bedtime stories and braiding hair. "Bear!" Jimmy called out, running to show Rico the completed puzzle. "Look what we made!" Rico lifted the boy onto the counter, examining the finished picture of a motorcycle. "That's some fine work there, buddy. Maybe someday I'll teach you to ride a real one." Sarah looked up from her chess game, her eyes serious. "Only when he's bigger, right?" "Way bigger," Rico assured her, touched by her protective instinct toward her brother. As afternoon faded into evening, the group gathered around the wooden table for dinner. Tank had surprised everyone by making his grandmother's lasagna recipe, and the smell of herbs and tomatoes filled the cabin. The bikers squeezed in around the small table, passing plates and sharing stories. Mouse told jokes that made the kids giggle, while Diesel taught them a clapping game he'd learned as a child. Rico watched it all, his heart full at the sight of his chosen family coming together. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Sarah brought out her mother's old guitar, which they'd managed to save. She sat cross-legged on the floor, strumming the few chords Rico had taught her. Jimmy leaned against Tank's leg, his eyes heavy with sleep. The room grew quiet as Sarah began to sing a lullaby, the same one her mother used to sing. Rico felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked around at his brothers, these men who had given up everything to protect these children. They'd lost Jax, but his sacrifice had given them all something precious, a chance at redemption, at family. Tank caught Rico's eye and nodded, understanding passing between them. They weren't just a motorcycle club anymore. They weren't even just protectors. They were family, bound by something stronger than blood or brotherhood. As the last notes of Sarah's song faded away, Jimmy crawled into Rico's lap, already half asleep. Sarah leaned against his side, her small hand finding his. The bikers sat in comfortable silence, the peace of the moment washing over them all. They had lost much to get here, but they had gained something more valuable than anything they'd left behind. They had found their home in each other. Rico sat in his favorite chair on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. His calloused hands held a mug of coffee, steam rising in the cool evening air. The sounds of Sarah and Jimmy playing inside with Tank and Mouse drifted through the open windows, their laughter a melody he'd grown to love. He remembered the first time he'd seen Sarah, dragging that guitar case into his garage. Back then, he'd been a different man. Harder, colder, more concerned with maintaining his tough reputation than showing kindness. The thought of being responsible for children had terrified him. Running his hand over his beard, Rico smiled at how much had changed. Just yesterday, he'd spent an hour braiding Sarah's hair before school, his large fingers carefully separating the strands while she chatted about her friends. Jimmy had sat nearby, insisting on wearing his leather vest that matched Rico's, though Rico had removed all the patches first. The door creaked open, and Mouse stepped out onto the porch. "Kids are asking for their bedtime story," he said, grinning. "Something about a promise to do all the voices this time?" Rico chuckled, setting down his coffee. "Can't break a promise to those two." Inside, Sarah and Jimmy had already changed into their pajamas and were sitting on the couch, a worn copy of their favorite book between them. Jimmy's eyes lit up when he saw Rico, and he patted the space beside him eagerly. "Bear, you have to do the dragon voice like you promised." Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide her smile. "Jimmy's been talking about it all day." Rico settled between them, feeling the familiar warmth as they snuggled close. The book was one they'd read dozens of times, but the children never tired of it. As he began to read, giving each character a distinct voice, he marveled at how natural this felt now. A year ago, he would have laughed if someone had told him he'd be reading bedtime stories and checking homework. His days had been filled with motorcycle runs and bar fights, not making school lunches, and attending parent-teacher conferences. Jimmy leaned heavily against his arm, eyes growing heavy as the story progressed. Sarah corrected Rico whenever he tried to skip a page, knowing the book by heart. The trust in their eyes, the way they relied on him without question, it filled his heart in a way no amount of respect from fellow bikers ever had. Tank appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with a knowing smile. He'd been there from the beginning, had seen the transformation in Rico, the way the tough biker had softened, learned to be gentle without losing his strength. "Just one more chapter," Sarah pleaded, as Rico finished a page. "You said that 3 chapters ago, Princess," Rico replied, but his tone was tender. "School tomorrow, remember?" She sighed but nodded, accepting the bookmark he handed her. Jimmy was already asleep, his small hand clutching Rico's sleeve. With practiced ease, Rico lifted the boy, carrying him to bed, while Sarah followed, yawning. As he tucked them in, Sarah whispered, "Love you, Bear." "Love you too, both of you," Rico replied softly, his voice rough with emotion. Standing in their doorway, watching their peaceful faces in the soft glow of the nightlight, Rico felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. These children, who had burst into his life so unexpectedly, had given him something he never knew he was missing, a purpose beyond the brotherhood, a love beyond anything he'd known before. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin's backyard as Rico and his brothers gathered around the fire pit. Tank had fired up the grill, the smell of barbecue filling the air. Mouse was teaching Jimmy how to play checkers on the picnic table, while Sarah helped set out paper plates and plastic cups. Rico watched his makeshift family with pride. The rough-looking bikers who'd once inspired fear now moved with gentle consideration around the children. Their leather vests and tattoos seemed less menacing nowadays, softened by the sound of children's laughter and casual conversation. "Burgers are ready," Tank called out, expertly flipping the patties onto a serving plate. The group gathered around the wooden picnic table, its surface weathered by sun and rain. Rico noticed how naturally Sarah leaned against his arm as she reached for the ketchup, how Jimmy automatically looked to him for permission before grabbing a second helping of chips. These small gestures of trust and family still amazed him. "Remember Jax," Mouse said quietly, raising his beer bottle. The mood shifted, becoming more solemn as everyone lifted their drinks in tribute. "To Jax," they echoed. Even the children joined in, understanding the weight of the moment. Sarah tugged at Rico's sleeve. "Tell us about Mom again," she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "The happy stories." Rico pulled her closer, making room for Jimmy to scramble onto the bench beside them. The other bikers leaned in, having heard pieces of these stories before, but always eager to learn more about the woman who had changed their brother's life. "Your mother," Rico began, his voice gentle, "had the most beautiful smile. She could light up any room she walked into." He paused, remembering. "The first time I met her, she was singing at this tiny bar downtown. Her voice—" He shook his head, smiling. "It was like nothing I'd ever heard before." Jimmy snuggled closer. "Did she sing to us too?" "Every night, from what she told me in her letters. She loved you both more than anything in this world." Rico's hand automatically went to the worn envelope in his vest pocket, containing the last letter she'd written him. Tank added, "She was fierce too. Wouldn't take nonsense from anyone. Not even your dad here when he was being stubborn." The children giggled at that, and Rico couldn't help but chuckle too. That's true. She always knew her own mind. Sarah pulled out an old photograph from her pocket, one showing her mother in a sundress, guitar in hand, her smile radiant. "You keep her alive in your stories," she said softly. Rico looked around at his family. The tough bikers who'd become uncles, the children who'd claimed his heart, the memory of their mother binding them all together. The setting sun painted everything in warm golden light, and for a moment he could almost feel her presence among them, approving of the family they'd become. "Your mom would be so proud of you both," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She always wanted you to be safe and loved. And now you are." Mouse raised his bottle again. "To family," he said simply. "To family," everyone echoed, and Rico felt the truth of it deep in his bones. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than anything he could have imagined. His heart was full, watching his children, because they were his now, in every way that mattered, surrounded by love and protection, finally safe and happy. The morning dew sparkled on the grass as Rico stood on the cabin's front porch, his hands resting on Sarah and Jimmy's shoulders. The sun peeked over the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine needles and fresh coffee brewing inside. Sarah wrapped her small fingers around Rico's calloused hand. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the colors dance across the sky. Jimmy pressed closer to Rico's leg, still sleepy, but unwilling to miss this moment. His injuries had healed well, leaving only faint scars that would fade with time. "Are we going to watch the sunrise every morning?" he asked, stifling a yawn. Rico squeezed their shoulders gently. "We can watch it whenever you want, kiddo." His voice was rough with emotion as he looked down at these two children who had changed his life so completely. The screen door creaked behind them as Tank stepped out, carrying 4 steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate for the munchkins," he said, carefully handing the smaller cups to the children. "And coffee for us grown-ups." Rico accepted his mug with a grateful nod, the warmth seeping into his hands. The morning was peaceful, so different from the chaos that had brought them together. He watched as Sarah blew carefully on her hot chocolate, her face serious with concentration, just like her mother used to do. "Look!" Jimmy pointed excitedly at a pair of eagles soaring overhead. "They're flying together." "Just like us," Sarah added softly. "We stick together too." Rico's heart swelled at her words. The tough exterior he'd maintained for so many years had crumbled in the face of these children's love. He'd never imagined himself as a father, but now he couldn't imagine being anything else. "You know," he said, setting his coffee down on the porch railing, "your mother once told me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who stays by your side when things get tough." He knelt down between them, meeting their eyes. And I want you both to know that I'll always be here, no matter what comes our way." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but she smiled bravely. "Promise?" "I promise," Rico said firmly, gathering them both into his arms. "You're my kids now, and nothing's ever gonna change that." Tank cleared his throat, trying to hide his own emotion. "They've got all of us, too. The whole crew." The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming their faces. Jimmy leaned his head against Rico's shoulder, contentment written across his small features. Sarah hummed softly, a tune their mother used to sing, as she watched the last stars fade from the morning sky. Rico held them close, feeling the steady beat of their hearts against his chest. The world stretched out before them, full of possibilities. There would be challenges ahead, he knew, but facing them together made all the difference. "I'll protect you both," he murmured, his voice thick with determination. "Always." The words weren't just a promise. They were a vow, as binding as any oath he'd ever taken. The children snuggled closer, secure in the knowledge that they were safe, that they were loved. Behind them, the cabin door opened again as more of their biker family emerged to greet the day. The sound of their quiet conversation and gentle laughter drifted across the porch, a reminder that none of them were alone anymore. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.